The music at the Galliano Gala was a lie. It was silk and champagne bubbles, but underneath, it was the hum of 1,000 silent wars. I stood near the balcony doors, Isabella Moretti, the daughter of Don Alberto Moretti, and I felt the weight of every gaze. This wasn't a party, it was a chessboard, and I was a piece my father had positioned carefully. I smoothed the deep emerald silk of my dress, a shield against the appraisal in the room. And then the air changed. It wasn't a sound, it was a vacuum. The crowd near the main entrance seemed to part like the Red Sea, not out of courtesy, but out of primal fear. And through that corridor of silence walked Vincenzo Rossi. He didn't need bodyguards. His presence was his own fortress. Tall, with a stillness that was more threatening than any sudden movement, he wore his power like a second skin. His black suit was impeccably tailored, but it couldn't disguise the brute strength in his shoulders, the corded muscle in his neck. His eyes, a chilling, impossible shade of winter sky gray, scanned the room. They were calculating, dismissing everyone they touched until they touched me. The world narrowed to that single point. The chatter, the music, the glittering chandeliers, it all faded into a dull roar. His gaze locked on mine, and it wasn't a look of curiosity or even desire. It was recognition. It was ownership. A cold shiver, entirely separate from the ballroom's chill, traced its way down my spine. I couldn't look away. I was pinned. He began to walk, his steps deliberate and silent on the polished marble. The sea of people remained parted, holding their collective breath. He didn't look left or right. His destination was singular. Me. Or rather, the man standing protectively beside me, my father. My father, Don Alberto, stiffened. I felt the shift in his posture, the way his hand, resting lightly on my arm, tightened into a vice. The air around us crackled with a tension so thick I could taste it, metallic, like blood yet to be spilled. Rossi stopped a mere foot away, close enough that I could see the faint scar cutting through his eyebrow, the dark shadow of stubble along his jaw. He didn't acknowledge me. His eyes, those terrifyingly calm gray eyes, were fixed on my father. He leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that carried no further than the three of us, yet it echoed like a gunshot in the silent space between our families. "Alberto," he said, the name a casual insult. Then his gaze flicked to me, a searing brand. "She is mine." The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. They weren't a request. They weren't a proposal. They were a declaration of fact, as undeniable as the sunrise. A tremor ran through my father's body, a silent earthquake of rage and fear. I saw the muscle in his jaw twitch, the vein pulsing at his temple. The unspoken war that had simmered for decades between the Morettis and the Rossis had just been ignited. And I was the match. My breath caught in my throat, a painful frozen lump. "She is mine." The words reverberated in my skull, each syllable a hammer blow. This couldn't be happening. Childhood warnings, whispered by my mother in hushed, fearful tones, rushed back. "Stay away from the Rossi boy, Isabella. Their blood is cursed. Their love is poison." I'd pictured a monster, a beast from a fairy tale. I hadn't pictured this devastatingly controlled man whose claim felt less like a threat and more like a prophecy. The feud was our inheritance, a rotten legacy passed down from our grandfathers. It was about territory, about respect, about a bloody night 30 years ago where a deal went wrong and a Rossi heir was left dead in a gutter. The Morettis were blamed. The Rossis swore vengeance. Our families had carved the city in two, a fragile truce maintained by distance and a mutual understanding of mutually assured destruction. We didn't socialize. We didn't do business. We existed in parallel, armed universes. But this? A public claim on the Don's only daughter? This wasn't just breaking the rules. This was burning the rule book and scattering the ashes. In the world I was born into, being claimed wasn't romance. It was annexation. It was the ultimate power play, a way for a rival to seize not just a person, but their family's honor, their future, their very soul. It meant I would become a Rossi. My children would be Rossis. The Moretti name, through my line, would be erased. My father, Don Alberto Moretti, was a proud man. His life was built on a foundation of respect, of iron control. To surrender his daughter would be to kneel publicly, to admit that Rossi's power was greater. It would shatter his authority, leave him vulnerable to every other ambitious family waiting in the wings. It would be a humiliation from which he could never recover. But the alternative was war. a war we weren't sure we could win. Rossi's rise had been meteoric, brutal, and absolute. He'd consolidated power with a legendary ruthlessness. To fight him meant bloodshed on a scale the city hadn't seen in generations. It meant my brothers, my uncles, our loyal soldiers, they would all be targets. It meant our homes, our businesses, our entire world would become a battlefield. The impossible choice was etched on my father's face as he stared down Vincenzo Rossi. Sacrifice his daughter to the wolf and live in shame, or sacrifice his entire family to a war that could end us all. The gala swirled around us, a grotesque masquerade of normalcy. But in that frozen circle, my father's silence was his answer. The war had already begun, and I was the trophy waiting to be claimed from the ashes. The silence in the armored town car was a physical thing, a suffocating blanket woven from fear and rage. My father hadn't spoken a word since Rossi's declaration. He just stared out the tinted window, his knuckles white as he gripped his knee, the usual commanding set of his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. It was that more than anything that terrified me. I'd seen him angry, I'd seen him calculating, but I had never, ever seen my father look defeated. The two bodyguards in the front seats were rigid, their eyes constantly scanning the streets reflected in the mirrors, hands never far from their holsters. The usual route home was abandoned for a labyrinth of side streets, the driver's movements sharp and paranoid. Every slowing car, every pedestrian who looked twice, was a potential threat. Rossi's words weren't just a claim, they were the first shot fired. The hunt had begun. "Papa!" My voice was a fragile thing in the heavy quiet. "What does this mean? What is he going to do?" He didn't look at me. His reflection in the glass was a ghost. "It means Vincenzo Rossi has finally lost the last pretense of civility," he said, his voice rough, stripped of its usual warmth. "It means he believes his power is so absolute that he can simply take what he wants. And he wants to break me. You are the most efficient tool for that." He finally turned, and the raw anguish in his eyes stole my breath. "His reputation is not an exaggeration, Isabella. Men who cross him don't just disappear. They are unmade. Their businesses are burned to the ground, their allies turned to ash. Their families." He trailed off, looking back out the window. "He is a plague. And I have brought this to our door. This isn't your fault," I whispered, the protest feeling weak and useless. "It is my only job to protect you. To protect this family," he countered, his tone final. "And now I am forced to choose between a war we may not win and a surrender that will destroy us just as completely. There is no negotiation with a man like that. This was never an offer. It was a declaration of war wrapped in a threat." The car turned onto the long, private road leading to our compound, and the massive iron gates swung open before us, sealing shut the moment we passed through with a final, deafening clang. The sound was a period at the end of a sentence. Our world, our safe, gilded cage, had just become a fortress under siege. And the truth settled in my bones, cold and hard. This wasn't a negotiation. My future had been decided in a whisper across a ballroom. I was the prize, and the battle for me would burn our city to the ground. The compound was a fortress, but tonight it felt like a tomb. The high stone walls, topped with razor wire, usually gave me a sense of security. Now they felt like the bars of my cage. As the car rolled to a stop on the grand circular drive, the front doors burst open. My brothers, Marco and Luca, rushed out, their faces etched with a panic I'd never seen. They'd already heard. The news had traveled faster than our car. "Inside. Now," my father barked, his voice regaining some of its steel as he stepped out, ushering me toward the entrance. The bodyguards fanned out, taking up positions with military precision. The lockdown had begun. I heard the heavy thud of bolts sliding into place, the electronic hum of security systems engaging at their highest level. The house, usually filled with life and noise, was eerily silent, the only sound the frantic footsteps of men preparing for a siege. We were herded into my father's study, the inner sanctum. The smell of old leather and whiskey filled the air. My mother was already there, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a handkerchief. She didn't say a word, just pulled me into a tight, desperate hug. My brothers paced like caged animals. "He can't be serious," Marco, the eldest, snarled. "It's a bluff. A power move. He thinks he can scare us into submission. Did you see his eyes?" My father poured a generous measure of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. his hand remarkably steady. That was not a bluff. That was a man stating a fact he intends to make true. He has wanted a reason to wipe us off the map for years. I just handed him the perfect one. Luca, always the strategist, went to the large map of the city pinned to the wall. Our strength is concentrated here, in the north and west. Rossi controls the docks, the financial district, the heart. If he moves tonight, he'll hit our revenue streams first. The restaurants, the clubs. He turned, his expression grim. We're strong, father. But he has more men. Better armed men. A cold dread settled deep in my stomach. I was standing in the middle of a war room, and I was the cause of it all. I looked at my family, my proud father, my terrified mother, my fierce brothers, and saw the weight of my existence bearing down on them. The decision was made without a formal vote. It was in the set of my father's jaw, the defiant gleam in Marco's eye. They would fight. For honor, for family, for me. They would choose a bloody war over a humiliating peace. No one touches my sister, Marco vowed, his voice low and deadly. He'll have to kill every last one of us first. The words were meant to be comforting, but they sent a new kind of chill through me. That was precisely what Vincenzo Rossi was prepared to do. I was taken upstairs, not to my room, but to a reinforced interior room with no windows. My mother stayed with me, her silence more frightening than any outburst. From my small, high window, I could see the shadows of our men taking positions along the walls, their silhouettes outlined against the city lights. I was the catalyst, the prize. And from this window, I would watch the world I knew be destroyed, piece by piece, all because a man I'd never spoken to had decided I belonged to him. The waiting was its own special kind of torture. The calm before the storm. And we all knew the storm was coming. It was just a matter of time. The first report came in just after midnight. A text message that made my father's phone buzz on the mahogany desk like an angry hornet. He picked it up, his face illuminated by the screen, and the color drained from his cheeks. Rossi's men just walked into Fortunato's, cleared out the safe, and set the place on their way out. Our flagship restaurant, the crown jewel of our legitimate empire, was gone. It wasn't just a financial hit, it was a message. Rossi wasn't just coming for me. He was systematically dismantling my father's entire life, brick by brick. The phone didn't stop after that. It was a relentless drumbeat of disaster. Each buzz was another piece of our world crumbling. The warehouse on the pier, our storage for less legitimate goods, was raided by men wearing police vests. Our bookmakers reported their lines going dead, their collectors suddenly unreachable. Rossi moved with terrifying surgical precision, hitting us everywhere at once. He wasn't just a brute. He was a general, and he'd been planning this offensive for a long, long time. My father's rage was a cold, silent inferno. He stopped pacing. The fear was burned away, replaced by a stern, flinty resolve. He started barking orders into his phone, his voice low and deadly calm. He was mobilizing our soldiers, pulling men from their posts, sending them out into the night to retaliate, to protect what was left. The quiet study became the nerve center of a war we were already losing. I watched him transform from a besieged Don back into a commander, but the shadow of Rossi's first, devastating strike hung over everything. From my window, I saw the headlights of our cars peeling out of the compound gates, carrying my brothers, our best men, into the fray. They were answering fire with fire, but it felt like throwing pebbles at a tsunami. The feeling of helplessness was a physical ache. This was all for me. The fires being set, the men risking their lives, the empire my father built being torn down. It was all because Vincenzo Rossi had looked at me and seen a thing to be owned. I wasn't a person. I was a pretext for annihilation. The phone on the desk rang again, its old-fashioned bell shrill in the tense air. This wasn't a text. This was a call. My father froze, his hand hovering over the receiver. Everyone in the room held their breath. He picked it up. Moretti. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. I could hear the faint, distorted rasp of a voice on the other end. Rossi's voice. My father's face was a stone mask, but I saw the tremor in the hand holding the phone. No, he said, the word flat and final. You will never have her. He listened for another second, his eyes closing as if in pain. Then he spoke again, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more frightening than a scream. Then you chose extinction. The line went dead. The words hung in the air, a death sentence for us all. My father slowly lowered the phone. He didn't look at any of us. He just stared at the wall as if already seeing the end. Outside, the sound of engines roared to life, not ours this time. Rossi's men were on the move. The ultimatum had been given. The refusal had been issued. The war was no longer a threat. It was here, and we could do nothing but wait for it to break against our walls. The silence after he hung up was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a vacuum that sucked all the air, all the hope from the room. My father didn't move. He just stood there, the dead phone receiver still clutched in his hand, his knuckles bone white. The words Rossi had spoken, the ones we'd all heard clearly from the other side of the room, echoed in the suffocating stillness. Then you chose extinction. It wasn't a threat. It was a verdict. My mother let out a small, choked sob, pressing her fist to her mouth. Marco slammed his hand against the wall, a raw, frustrated sound. Luca stared at the floor, his mind clearly racing through strategies that no longer existed. The chessboard had been flipped over. This was no longer a game of moves and countermoves. Rossi had just announced he was setting the whole table on fire. And then the sound came. Not from the phone, but from outside. A low, gathering rumble like distant thunder rolling in from a clear sky. It was the sound of engines. Dozens of them. Not the discreet purr of our sedans, but the aggressive growl of high-performance vehicles. The sound grew louder, closer, surrounding the compound. It was the sound of the extinction Rossi had promised, arriving at our doorstep. My father finally moved, placing the receiver back in its cradle with a deliberate, final click. He looked at each of us, his eyes holding a strange, heartbreaking mixture of love and absolute despair. "It's time," he said, his voice rough. "To your positions. Isabella with your mother. Now." There was no time for goodbyes, for last words. The moment was shattered by the first crack of gunfire. A single, sharp report that was instantly swallowed by a deafening volley. The siege had begun. As my mother pulled me from the study, my father was already barking orders into a radio, his voice cutting through the chaos. The last thing I saw was him drawing a pistol from his desk drawer, his face a mask of grim acceptance. He had drawn his line in the sand, and now the tide was coming in. The gunfire wasn't distant anymore. It was here, a deafening storm of sharp cracks and deep booms that slammed against the reinforced walls of the house. The first shots had been aimed at the perimeter gates, testing our defenses. Now the fight was at our doorstep. From the small, high window of the interior room, I saw the flashes of muzzle fire lighting up the night, illuminating the frantic movements of our men along the outer wall. Shadows danced and fell. The sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder began to seep through the sealed windows, a sickening perfume of violence. My mother pulled me away from the window, her grip like iron. "Get down, Isabella." Away from the glass. She dragged me to the floor, behind the heavy oak desk. We huddled together, the thick wood feeling pitifully thin against the fury outside. Every burst of gunfire made us flinch. Every shout, every scream that cut through the night was a fresh wave of terror. This was no longer a symbolic gesture, a show of force. This was a full-scale assault. Rossi meant to take this compound. He meant to take me by force tonight. I could hear my father's voice, distorted by a walkie-talkie somewhere down the hall. His commands were clipped and calm, but I could listen to the strain beneath. "Hold the east gate. Fall back to the secondary position if you have to. Do not let them breach the inner courtyard." The chaos was a living thing, clawing its way inside. The sound of shattering glass came from the front of the house. A window? A door? The fighting was moving inside our walls. The fortress was being invaded. A frantic pounding on our door made us both jump. "Signora! Isabella! We have to move you. Now!" It was Carlo, one of my father's most trusted men. His face was smudged with soot, and there was a wild panic in his eyes I'd never seen before. He ushered us out of the room and into the hallway, which was now filled with the sounds of close-quarters combat. The sickening thud of bodies hitting walls, guttural shouts, the blast of a shotgun that was far, far too close. We were rushed down a back staircase toward the basement, toward the panic room. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the narrow space, a frantic counterpoint to the symphony of destruction above us. With every step, the fear intensified. This was really happening. They were inside our home. The question that had been haunting me since the gala now screamed in my mind with every heartbeat. Could we hold until dawn? Or was this the night the Moretti name was wiped from the earth? All because of me? The heavy steel door of the panic room hissed shut behind us, sealing us in a sterile, silent tomb. The thick walls muted the sounds of the battle, turning them into a distant, ominous rumble. But we could still feel it. Every vibration through the floor was a reminder that just beyond this door, men were fighting and dying. My father's last stand was happening without me. I was safe in this metal box, but the guilt was a heavier prison than any steel door. I was the reason for the bloodshed. I was the prize in a war I never wanted. And the cost of me was being paid in the lives of everyone I loved. The wait in the dark was agony. The only thing worse than the noise was the silence that might follow it. Across the city, in a soundproofed command center that overlooked the glittering skyline, Vincenzo Rossi watched the assault unfold on a wall of high-definition monitors. The feed from the drones circling the Moretti compound was crystal clear, a brutal ballet of shadows and muzzle flashes. He stood perfectly still, a glass of neat bourbon untouched on the table beside him, his expression unreadable. To his lieutenants, he was the picture of calm command. But inside, a different storm raged. His obsession with Isabella Moretti hadn't begun tonight. It had started months ago, a flicker of lightning in a dead sky. He'd seen her by chance, leaving a downtown charity foundation. Not the gilded princess at a ball, but a woman with a stack of files, her hair coming loose from its knot, arguing passionately with a city planner about zoning for a community garden. There was a fire in her, a stubborn, beautiful light that was entirely her own. Not a reflection of her father's power, but a source of it. In that moment, the plan that had been about cold vengeance for his father's murder began to curdle into something else. Something personal. He'd watched her since then. He knew her routines, her quiet kindness to the bakery owner on her street, the way she'd sit for hours in the public library, lost in books of history. She was the antithesis of the world he ruled, a world of darkness, betrayal, and blood. Claiming her tonight wasn't just the ultimate humiliation for Alberto Moretti. It was a desperate, violent act of possession. She was the only pure, untainted thing he had ever wanted, and his only language was conquest. His second-in-command, Silvio, shifted beside him. "The east gate is compromised, Don Rossi. Our men are in the courtyard." The traitor delivered as promised. Vincenzo didn't take his eyes off the screen, where a figure that looked like Marco Moretti was fighting with desperate fury. "Tell them the girl is in the basement panic room. I want her extracted. Unharmed. Anyone who so much as scratches her answers to me." His voice was ice, but his blood was fire. This war, this destruction he'd orchestrated with such cold certainty, was the only way he knew how to bridge the impossible gap between their worlds. He wasn't just burning her kingdom to the ground. He was building a new one from the ashes, and he intended to place her on its throne right beside him. The certainty of his victory was absolute. Tonight, Isabella Moretti ceased to be a Moretti. By sunrise, she would be his. The distant rumble through the panic room floor suddenly turned into a violent shudder, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood and shouting directly above us. They were inside the house. The reinforced door to our sanctuary felt less like protection and more like a target. My mother clutched my hand, her breathing shallow and fast. We could hear the thunder of boots on the main floor, the crash of furniture being overturned, and the sporadic gunfire, now terrifyingly close. They were searching room by room, and we were at the end of the hunt. The shouting grew louder, right outside the basement door. A man's voice, guttural and commanding, barked orders. Then came the sound I'd been dreading. Heavy, deliberate footsteps descending the wooden stairs. They stopped outside our steel door. A moment of silence, more terrifying than any noise. Then a series of sharp, metallic clicks. They weren't trying to break it down. They had a key. The traitor had given them everything. The door hissed open, flooding the sterile room with the chaotic sounds and smells of the battle above. Smoke, sweat, and blood. Two of Rossi's men filled the doorway, their faces hard, their weapons held ready but pointed at the floor. They didn't speak. They just motioned for us to come out. My mother stood her ground, placing herself in front of me. "You will not touch her," she said, her voice trembling but clear. One of the men simply shook his head. "Don Rossi's orders. The girl comes with us. You stay." The reality of the separation hit me like a physical blow. I was being taken, and my mother was being left behind in this house of horrors. I looked at her, at the sheer terror and defiance in her eyes, and knew I had no choice. If I fought, if I screamed, they would hurt her. My compliance was the only shield I had left to offer her. "It's okay, Mama," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I stepped out from behind her, my legs feeling like water. The men took my arms, their grips firm but not cruel. As they led me up the stairs, I glanced back. My mother stood in the doorway of the panic room, a solitary figure in the harsh fluorescent light, her hand outstretched as if she could still pull me back. It was the last image I had of my home, my mother's despair, and the ruins of my father's world. The main floor was a nightmare. Smoke hung in the air. The grand foyer was littered with broken glass and overturned furniture. Several of our men were on their knees against a wall, guarded by Rossi's soldiers. I didn't see my father. I didn't see my brothers. The absence was a gaping wound. They guided me through the wreckage and out the shattered front door. The cool night air was a shock. And there, standing calmly in the center of the courtyard amidst the aftermath of his victory, was Vincenzo Rossi. He was watching me, his winter-gray eyes taking in my disheveled state, the tear tracks I couldn't hide on my cheeks. He had walked through the war he started, and his suit was still impeccably clean. He had won, and I was the spoils. Rossi's men led me across the courtyard, my bare feet scraping against the gravel. The scene was one of absolute victory for him, absolute defeat for us. And then I saw him. Marco, my cousin. He was standing near one of the SUVs, not as a prisoner, but talking calmly with one of Rossi's lieutenants. He wasn't bound. He wasn't under guard. He saw me, and for a fleeting second, our eyes met. There was no fear in his, only a cold, unsettling satisfaction. Then he looked away, dismissing me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing the last of my breath. The open back entrance. The way Rossi's men had moved through our defenses with such impossible precision, knowing exactly where to go. It wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a betrayal from within. Marco, our blood. He had sold us out. The reason was as old as time itself, power. Rossi had promised him what my father never would, a seat at the head of the table. Marco had always been ambitious, chafing under my father's command, bitter that as a nephew, he would never inherit the full mantle of Don. Rossi had offered him a kingdom of his own, carved from the ruins of ours. The price was simple. Open the gates and deliver me. The devastating moment of comprehension was worse than the guns, worse than the fear. It was a poison that seeped into the very foundation of my identity. Family was supposed to be everything. It was the code we lived and died by. And Marco had shattered it for a promise. Our defense hadn't just been overwhelmed. It had collapsed from within by the rod of his ambition. As I was guided toward Rossi, I looked back at the house, at the family I knew was still trapped inside, and understood the actual cost of this night. It wasn't just territory or businesses. It was trust. It was loyalty. It was the very idea of who we were. And that betrayal cut deeper than any blade Rossi could have wielded. Vincenzo watched me process it all, my face an open book of shock and hurt. He didn't gloat. He observed, as if studying the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. His victory was now complete. He had not only broken our walls and our soldiers, he had broken our spirit. He had proven that the bonds I believed were unbreakable had a price. And in that moment, standing amidst the wreckage of my life, surrounded by the men of the man who had orchestrated it all, I felt more alone than I had ever thought possible. The war was over. I was the prize. And the man who had handed me to my captor shared my last name. He stood there, a statue of victory amidst the chaos he'd orchestrated. Vincenzo Rossi didn't need to move, to speak, to gloat. His presence in the center of our courtyard, our sanctuary, was the only statement that mattered. His winter-gray eyes tracked me as his men brought me forward, his gaze a physical weight that felt more invasive than their hands on my arms. He didn't look at the smoldering ruins of our gate, the kneeling figures of our men, the blood staining the gravel. His entire world had narrowed to me. My father emerged from the shattered front door, flanked by two of Rossi's soldiers. His suit was torn, a dark bruise already blooming on his cheekbone, but he held himself with a crumbling dignity that broke my heart. His eyes found mine, and in them, I saw a universe of apology and despair. He had fought his war, and he had lost. Everything. Rossi finally moved, taking a single, deliberate step toward my father. The air crackled. Alberto, he said, his voice low, devoid of triumph, simply factual. The time for defiance is over. My father spat on the ground at Rossi's feet, a final, futile act of rebellion. You are a plague, Rossi. You can take my home, my business, my life. But you will never own her soul. A ghost of a smile, cold and utterly humorless, touched Rossi's lips. It was the most terrifying expression I had ever seen. Her soul is not yours to give, he said softly. Then his eyes flicked to the men holding me. Bring her. They pulled me toward a waiting black sedan, its door held open. I twisted for one last look. A final glimpse of my father standing defiant and broken before the ruins of his life. His eyes met mine, and he gave an almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't surrender. It was a promise that this wasn't over. And then the car door closed, sealing me in silence and expensive leather, and the reflection of my own terrified, captured face replaced the image of my father. The last of the Morettis taken. The world outside the tinted window was a blur of shadows and distant city lights, a stark contrast to the violent intimacy of the courtyard we'd just left. The car was a tomb of silence, gliding through the night as if the war had been a bad dream. I sat as far from him as the luxurious leather seat would allow, pressed against the door, my arms wrapped tightly around myself. The scent of his cologne, something dark and expensive like sandalwood and smoke, filled the space, a constant, suffocating reminder of his presence. He didn't look at me at first. He just stared out his own window, his profile sharp and unreadable in the intermittent flashes of streetlights. I could feel the heat of my anger and fear radiating from me, a silent scream in the quiet car. This was the price of my father's defiance. This ride into the unknown was the cost of the word no. I was the living, breathing invoice for a war lost in a single night. After several long minutes, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that didn't require him to turn. The anger will pass, he said, as if commenting on the weather. The fear will fade. You'll understand eventually why this was necessary. I didn't answer. My silence was the only weapon I had left, a frail shield against his certainty. To speak would be to acknowledge him, to enter into the twisted reality he was building around me. I focused on the passing buildings, trying to memorize a route, an escape, anything to cling to. But we were moving too fast, the turns too deliberate. He was taking me to his world, and ensuring I could never find my way back. He did turn then, his gaze a physical weight that pulled my eyes toward him against my will. Your defiance is a waste of energy, Isabella. It changes nothing. You destroyed my family, I whispered, the words scraping my throat. It wasn't an argument. It was just a fact laid bare in the space between us. I ended a war that would have consumed both our families for another generation, he corrected, his tone chillingly reasonable. Your father's pride was a cancer. I cut it out. What comes next, what we build, will be stronger. The audacity of it, the sheer, monstrous rewriting of history stole my breath. He wasn't a conqueror in his mind. He was a surgeon, a savior. My continued resistance was, to him, a symptom of a sickness he was determined to cure. I turned back to the window, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. He watched me for a moment longer, then let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh and returned to his contemplation of the night. The car eventually turned off the main highway, climbing a winding, private road lined with ancient cypress trees. At the crest of the hill, his estate came into view, and a fresh wave of despair washed over me. It wasn't just a house. It was a fortress that made my father's compound look like a summer cottage. Impossibly tall walls, modern and severe, surrounded a sprawling, lit palazzo that seemed to command the entire city below. It was grander, colder, more imposing than anything I had ever seen. This wasn't just a new cage. It was a monument to his power, and my place in it was as a captured treasure, displayed behind glass. The massive gates slid open silently, and we passed through into a courtyard of manicured gardens and serene fountains, a grotesque parody of peace. The car stopped. The driver opened my door. The reality of my new prison settled over me, heavy and final. I was here. The war was over. And the much more terrifying battle for my own will was beginning. Vincenzo Rossi stepped out and offered me his hand. I ignored it, stepping onto the gravel on my own shaky legs. His lips tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his composure I had seen all night. It was a small victory, meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but I clung to it like a lifeline as I walked into the lion's den. He led me through grand, silent halls that felt more like a museum than a home. Every surface was polished marble or dark, exotic wood. Artifacts and paintings that probably belonged behind velvet ropes lined the walls. It was opulent, sterile, and utterly cold. There were people. A maid scurrying past with her eyes downcast, a butler who gave a stiff nod, but no one spoke. No one met my eyes. I was a ghost walking through another ghost's mausoleum. My new quarters were at the end of a long hallway on the second floor. The room itself was a paradox. It was beautiful, draped in silks and velvets in deep burgundy and gold. A massive four-poster bed, an antique writing desk, and a seating area by a large window. It was more luxurious than my room at home. But the luxury was the trap. The door locked from the outside. The windows, when I rushed to them, were sealed panes of reinforced glass, offering a breathtaking but useless view of the city lights twinkling far below. I was in a gilded cage with a view of everything I had lost. The door opened, and a different maid entered, carrying a tray. She placed it on the desk without a word, a carafe of water, a bowl of fruit, a simple sandwich. Her movements were efficient, robotic. "Does Don Rossi require anything else?" she asked, her voice a monotone, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere past my shoulder. "I want to speak to him," I demanded, my voice shaking with anger I barely recognized. "Don Rossi will speak with you when he is ready," she recited as if from a script. She turned and left, the lock clicking back into place with a sound that echoed in the spacious room. I was alone, completely and utterly alone. The silence was a heavy blanket, smothering me. The reality of my isolation was a physical blow. My family was gone. My home was gone. My freedom was gone. I was a possession now, locked away in a display case. And the only thing left was the storm of my own rage and despair, raging silently against the unbreakable glass. Hours bled into each other in the silent room. The sandwich sat untouched, the water warm. I paced, my bare feet silent on the thick rug, tracing the same path from the locked door to the sealed window and back. The city lights were a taunt, a map of a world that was no longer mine. Anger had burned down to a cold, hard ember of dread in my chest. What happened now? What did a man like Rossi do with a captive prize once the battle was won? The lock clicked. I froze, my back to the door, facing the window. I expected the maid again, or one of his stone-faced soldiers. But the footsteps were different. Heavier. More deliberate. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. The air in the room changed, thickening with his presence. I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, the lingering hint of night air and smoke. He didn't speak at first. I heard the soft clink of ceramic as he set a new tray on the desk. "You should eat," his voice said, low and close behind me. It wasn't a command. It was an observation, an unnervingly gentle one. I spun around, my arms crossed tightly. "What do you want?" He stood by the desk, having changed from his suit into dark trousers and a simple black sweater. He looked younger, less like the monster from the battlefield and more like a man. It was a dangerous shift. He gestured to the tray. It held a bowl of steaming pasta, simple and fragrant with garlic and oil, a stark contrast to the sterile sandwich from before. "I brought this myself. The kitchen staff is dismissed for the night." The gesture was so bizarrely domestic, so out of place, that it threw me completely off balance. The conqueror playing the caretaker. I just stared at him, my mind reeling. This was not the gloating Victor I had prepared myself for. He pulled out the chair at the desk and sat, not facing me, but looking out the same window I had been staring at for hours. "My father was a butcher," he began, his tone conversational, as if we were old friends catching up. "Your father was a businessman. They had an agreement. Respect. Territory. My father trusted that agreement. Your father used that trust to ambush him in a warehouse. Took everything. Left his body for the rats." I flinched. This was his version of our history. The justification for the burning and the blood. "That's not true," I whispered, but the protest sounded weak, even to my own ears. I only knew my father's stories, the tales of Rossi's aggression, of stolen shipments and murdered allies. He finally turned to look at me, his gray eyes capturing the dim light from the window. "Isn't it? For 20 years I've planned for this night. To erase the Moretti name from this city as completely as my father was erased. It was going to be simple, brutal, final. He paused, his gaze intensifying, stripping away my defenses. And then I saw you. And the plan changed. The admission hung in the air, more shocking than any threat. His original intention had been genocide. What did that make his feelings for me? A last-minute stay of execution? A whim that saved my life but condemned me to this? My feelings are not a lie, Isabella, he said, as if reading the turmoil on my face. They are the most inconvenient truth of my life. He stood up, leaving the food. He walked to the door but stopped with his hand on the knob. He didn't look back. The anger is understandable, the hatred expected. But the food is just food. Eat. We have tomorrow to discuss. Then he was gone, the lock sliding back into place. I stood there, trembling, the scent of pasta now mingling with the smell of his confession. He hadn't tried to force me. He hadn't threatened me. He had explained. And in doing so, he had planted the first dangerous seed of doubt in the fertile ground of my hatred. The monster had just shown me a glimpse of the man, and it was far more terrifying than the beast had ever been. I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion, because I woke to sunlight streaming through the unbreakable glass, casting long, accusing fingers across the luxurious rug. For a single blissful moment, I forgot. The softness of the sheets, the quiet of the room. It felt like any other morning. Then the memory crashed down, a tidal wave of horror that left me gasping. The gala, the declaration, the siege, the betrayal. Rossi, this room, this cage. I scrambled out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. The city below looked peaceful, bathed in the clear light of dawn. But everything had changed. My world had ended while I slept. I went to the door, half expecting it to be unlocked, for last night to have been a nightmare. The handle didn't budge. The reality was as solid and cold as the metal in my hand. A soft knock preceded the turning of the lock. The same silent maid entered, this time carrying a breakfast tray and a stack of fresh clothes. She placed them on the desk, her eyes carefully averted. Don Rossi requests your presence in the library in 1 hour, she said, her voice barely a whisper, and retreated, locking the door behind her. Requests. The word was so civil, so grotesquely normal. As if I were a guest, not a prisoner. I ignored the food and went to the small television mounted on the wall, fumbling with the remote. The screen flickered to life, tuned to a local news channel. The lead story made my blood run cold. The anchor's face was professionally somber. In a shocking overnight development, prominent businessman Alberto Moretti and his family have reportedly left the city following a violent attack on their estate. A grainy, distant photo of our compound, its gates shattered, filled the screen. Sources close to the family cite credible threats to their safety as the reason for their sudden and indefinite relocation. The police have no comment at this time. Relocation. The word was a lie so smooth, so complete, it was terrifying. They had vanished, just as Rossi had declared. The official story was already being woven, a blanket of plausible deniability thrown over the blood and fire. My family was gone, erased. I stared at the screen, a numb disbelief settling over the sharp edges of my fear. This was what vanished truly meant. Not just gone, but memory hold. Their existence rewritten into a polite, convenient fiction. The hour passed in a blur of panic. When the maid returned to escort me, I followed her on numb legs. The library was a vast, 2-story room lined with leather-bound books. Rossi stood by a massive fireplace, holding a folded newspaper. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "You've seen the news," he stated. It wasn't a question. "You killed them," I accused, my voice trembling. He shook his head, a faint, weary gesture. "They are alive, Isabella. Exiled, but alive. Their safety is contingent on one thing, and one thing only." He held my gaze, his gray eyes utterly serious. "Your cooperation. You play the part of the willing companion, and they live comfortable, anonymous lives far from here. You fight me, you try to run, you embarrass me, and the protection I've extended vanishes." He let the implication hang in the silent, book-lined room. "The bargain is simple. Your pretense of acceptance of their lives. Do you understand?" The terms were laid out with chilling clarity. My defiance was no longer just an act of rebellion. It was a death sentence for my family. My father's proud refusal had cost us our home. My continued resistance would cost them their lives. The first crack in my defiance wasn't a softening of my hatred for him. It was the crushing weight of responsibility for the people I loved. My freedom was gone. Now my anger had to be buried, too. I looked at the man who held all the cards, who had rewritten the world in a single night, and I gave the only answer I could. I understand. The words tasted like ash. It was the beginning of my transformation, not into his willing companion, but into his perfect prisoner. The war was over. The occupation had begun. The silence after my surrender was heavier than any lock. He didn't smile in triumph. He nodded, a businessman acknowledging that the terms of a contract had been accepted. "A car will take you into the city this afternoon," he said, his tone shifting from conqueror to CEO. "You will be seen having lunch at Giovanni's. You will smile. You will appear content. My men will be watching. The press will be watching. Your performance begins now." This was the bargain. My freedom for their lives. My dignity for their safety. It was a transaction that stripped me bare more effectively than any physical capture ever could. He was turning my love for my family into the very chain that bound me to him. Later, dressed in clothes his stylist had provided, elegant, expensive, but not my own, I was driven to the restaurant. The maitre d' greeted me with a knowing, obsequious bow. "This way, Signorina Moretti. Don Rossi's usual table is prepared." The entire city was in on the charade. I sat alone at the best table, picking at food I couldn't taste, feeling every eye in the room upon me. The whispers were a palpable hum. "Is that her? The Moretti girl? Look how calm she is. She must be with him willingly." The performance was excruciating. Every forced smile felt like a betrayal of my father, of my brothers, of everything we had lost. But I did it. I played the part of the placid, calm woman. I saw Rossi's men positioned discreetly around the room, their presence a constant reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just a lunch. It was the first public proof of life for my family. My compliance was their oxygen. That evening, back in the gilded cage, the promised phone call came. A secure line was brought to my room. My mother's voice, when she spoke, was thin and frayed with tears. "Isabella? Baby, are you all right?" The sound of her crying, of the desperate relief in her voice, shattered the last of my resolve. "We're safe, darling. We're together." He's keeping his word. I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. I just listened to her weep, to the muffled sounds of my family in the background, alive. The call lasted less than a minute before the line went dead. The connection was severed, but the message was seared into my soul. Their safety was absolute, and it was conditional on this unbearable performance. When Rossi came to my room that night, he didn't bring food or explanations. He stood in the doorway observing me. I didn't look at him. I stared at the phone as if I could still see my mother's face. "The performance was adequate," he said, his voice devoid of praise, merely an assessment. He saw the crack in my armor, the reluctant agreement that had taken root in the fertile soil of my love for my family. He saw the first seedling of my transformation, and his satisfaction was a quiet, chilling thing. He had won the war not just with bullets, but with a bargain. And I had just signed the treaty with my own heart. The days bled into a strange, suspended rhythm. My world shrank to the dimensions of this beautiful prison and the carefully choreographed public appearances that proved my family was still breathing. I played my part. I wore the clothes his stylist provided. I smiled on his arm at the opera, at charity galas, in restaurants where the other patrons watched us with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. I was the prize on display, and my performance was flawless. But in the silence of his fortress, a different reality took shape. He never entered my room again after dark. He never touched me beyond the necessary, possessive grip on my arm in public. His men were always present, but distant, more like statues than jailers. The violence I had braced for never came. Instead, an unnerving respect settled in. He began to include me in his evenings, not as a captive, but as a silent observer. I would sit in an armchair in his study, pretending to read, while he conducted his business. And his business, it wasn't what I expected. I'd been raised on stories of his brutality, of back-alley deals and blood-soaked money. But the man in the study was a CEO, a strategist. He spoke of real estate development, of international imports, of legitimate enterprises that employed thousands. The monster of my father's stories was discussing municipal zoning laws and economic impact reports. The contrast was dizzying. It chipped away at the foundation of my hatred, leaving me confused and off balance. Small kindnesses appeared. A book by an author I'd once mentioned liking was left on my desk. A cup of tea, prepared exactly how I took it, would be waiting for me after a cold evening out. They were tiny things, insignificant on their own, but in the context of a war, they were seismic. They were the actions of a man, not a monster. They were observations, not commands. And each one was a dangerous crack in the wall I'd built around myself. My hatred, once a fiery certainty, began to cool into a complicated, terrifying confusion. My resolve, built on defiance, was softening under the relentless, silent pressure of his unexpected patience. The most dangerous battle wasn't against his power anymore. It was against the slow, terrifying realization that the man I was supposed to hate might not be entirely what I thought. The invitation arrived on heavy, embossed stationery. The annual fall gala at the city's art museum, the most public event of the social season. It was the ultimate stage for my performance, and Rossi accepted on our behalf without consulting me. The days leading up to it were a blur of fittings and a silent, growing dread. This wasn't just another dinner. This was where my father's world and Rossi's world collided in a glittering public arena. Everyone who had ever known me would be watching. The night arrived. The dress his stylist chose was a weapon, a sheath of midnight blue velvet that clung to every curve, elegant and devastating. The jewelry was heavy, cold diamonds that felt like manacles. As Rossi fastened the necklace, his fingers brushing the nape of my neck, I met my own eyes in the mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger, a beautiful hollow doll. "Remember the bargain," he said softly, his reflection's gaze locking with mine. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. My family's lives hung in the balance with every smile, every touch. The gala was a symphony of whispered judgment. The grand hall fell into a hushed silence as we entered, his hand a firm, possessive brand on the small of my back. I could feel the stares, could hear the hissed comments behind fluttering fans. Look at her. How could she? After what he did to them. I kept my chin high, a serene mask glued to my face. I played my part perfectly. I leaned into his touch. I laughed at his dry comments. I let my hand rest on his arm as we moved through the crowd. It was the most challenging acting I had ever done, each gesture a betrayal of my screaming soul. During a slow waltz, he pulled me closer than necessary, his voice a whisper against my ear. "They are watching, Isabella. You're old friends. Your mother's circle. Your performance is convincing." His words were a double-edged sword, praise for my acting, and a reminder of the audience whose judgment mattered most. The faces of women I'd known since childhood swam in my vision, their expressions a mixture of pity and disgust. My internal conflict was a raging fire, but externally, I was ice. I met his gaze, allowing a flicker of the hatred I felt to show in my eyes, a secret message only he could see. His own eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition. He saw the struggle beneath the compliance, and to my shock, there was no anger in his look. There was something else. Something like respect. The turning point came as we were leaving. A man, emboldened by champagne and old loyalty to my father, stepped into our path. "Moretti," he slurred, glaring at me with contempt. "I hope he's paying you well for the show." The insult was crude and public. Before I could even react, Rossi moved. He didn't raise his voice. He shifted his stance, placing himself slightly in front of me, and the temperature around us dropped 10 degrees. "Apologize to the lady," he said, his voice so quiet it was more dangerous than a shout. The man's bravado evaporated under that gray-eyed stare. He stammered an apology and scurried away. Rossi didn't look at me. He just guided me forward, but his hand on my back was different. Less possessive, more protective. In that moment, the monster had defended my honor against one of my own. The world I was trying to navigate had just been turned completely upside down, and the ground beneath my feet felt less solid than ever. The following week, he took me to the opera. It was a new production of Tosca, a story of obsession, betrayal, and sacrifice that felt unnervingly close to home. I sat beside him in the velvet-lined box, the tragic aria washing over me, a perfect soundtrack to my own imprisonment. I was lost in the music, in the story of a woman trapped by a powerful man's desire, when I saw it. A glint of light from the opposite balcony, a reflection off a telescopic lens. It wasn't a camera. My body knew what my mind refused to process. Time seemed to slow, the singer's voice fading into a distant hum. The man was aiming. Not at the stage. At our box. At him. I didn't think. There was no calculation, no weighing of the bargain or my hatred. Pure, instinctive reaction took over. As the first notes of the aria swelled to a crescendo, I lunged sideways, throwing my body against Rossi's just as a sharp crack echoed, swallowed by the music. The bullet meant for his heart shattered the gilded molding behind where his head had been a second before. Chaos erupted. Screams. People are diving for cover. His men were on us in an instant, forming a human shield, guns drawn. But Rossi wasn't looking at the threat. He was looking at me. His face was a mask of utter shock. He was still holding me, my body pressed against his, my heart hammering against his chest. He had felt my instinct, my unquestioning move to protect him. In his eyes, I saw the monster's certainty shatter. He saw not a prisoner performing for her family's safety, but a woman who had acted to save his life. Back in the car, the silence was thicker than ever. He didn't speak until we were inside the fortress, in the stark quiet of his study. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, his hand unusually unsteady. He handed one to me. I took it, my own hands trembling. "Why?" he asked, his voice raw. It was the first real question he had ever asked me. The anger, the defiance, the carefully constructed walls. They were gone, burned away by the adrenaline. The truth was all that was left. "I don't know," I whispered, staring into the amber liquid. "I just did it." He moved to stand before the fireplace, his back to me. "For 20 years, my only purpose was vengeance. To destroy the Moretti name. You were to be the final symbol of that victory. A trophy." He turned, and his eyes held a vulnerability I had never imagined possible. "But you are not a symbol. You are a person who, despite every reason to wish me dead, saved my life. My intention, and what I feel now, are at war." It was the first time he had acknowledged the impossibility of our situation not as his problem to solve, but as a shared burden. The conqueror and the captive, bound together by a single unthinking act of protection. The acknowledgement hung between us, a fragile truce in the silent dark. The truce of that night was fragile, a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark lake. He kept his distance, our interactions shifting from those of captor and prisoner to something more akin to wary roommates bound by a shared, traumatic secret. The bargain still held, my performance for my family's lives, but the performance now felt different. Less like a lie and more like a complicated, unspoken dance. A few days later, restless and needing to escape the confines of my room, I wandered the silent halls of his fortress. I found myself drawn to his study, the scene of our first real conversation. It was empty. The lingering scent of his cigar and the neat stacks of papers on his desk were the only signs of him. My eyes fell on a prominent, leather-bound journal tucked away on a lower shelf, partially hidden by other books. It was older, the leather cracked with age. Something about it felt forbidden, an artifact from a past he kept locked away. A reckless curiosity, the same instinct that had made me lunge in front of a bullet, took over. I pulled it out. The pages were filled with a strong, slanted script, his father's. I began to read, my heart thudding in my ears. It wasn't a butcher's journal. It was the meticulous record of a businessman, detailing shipments, territory agreements, and a deep, abiding trust in his partner, Alberto Moretti. The entries were dry, factual until the last one. The date was the day of the ambush. The handwriting was rushed, agitated. "Alberto is late. The warehouse is too quiet. Something feels wrong. He promised this deal would secure our family's futures. I pray my suspicion is misplaced." That was it, the final entry. The truth, written in the victim's own hand, was a sledgehammer to everything I believed. My father hadn't been defending himself from a ruthless aggressor. He had been the aggressor. He had orchestrated a cowardly ambush, betraying a man who trusted him, for a larger share of the territory. The stolen territory, the foundation of our family's wealth, was built on a lie. On my father's sin. Rossi's claim didn't rest on mere moral ground. It was built on a bedrock of righteous vengeance for a murderous betrayal. My entire worldview, the justification for my hatred, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces on the study's polished floor. The monster I had been taught to fear was the son seeking justice. And the father I had revered was the real monster all along. The journal felt like a live wire in my hands, burning the truth into my skin. I didn't wait. I didn't plan. A storm of betrayal, not his, but my own father's, propelled me from the study. I found him in the courtyard, standing by the fountain, his back to me. The calm serenity of the scene was a mockery. I didn't shout. My voice was a low, shaking thing, ripped from a place of deep, personal ruin. I held up the journal. "What is this?" He turned, and for a fraction of a second, I saw genuine surprise in his eyes before his usual mask of control slid back into place. But it was too late. I had seen it. He hadn't meant for me to find this. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his tone dangerously even. "It doesn't matter. Is it true? Did he murder yours in cold blood?" The words tasted like poison. He didn't deny it. He didn't deflect. He watched me, his gray eyes absorbing my pain, my crumbling world. "It's true," he said, the two words landing with the weight of a tombstone. The feud didn't start with territory disputes. It started with a bullet in the back from a man he called a friend. The confirmation was a physical blow. I staggered back, the journal slipping from my fingers to the stone pavement. The foundation of my entire life, my love for my father, my hatred for this man, was built on a lie. "You knew," I whispered, the realization dawning. "You knew all along, and you never told me. You let me hate you. What would you have had me do, Isabella?" he asked, a rare flash of anger in his voice. "Tell you your beloved father was a murderer? Would you have believed me? Or would you have thought it was just another one of my lies?" He took a step toward me, the space between us crackling. "My original plan was simple. Annihilation. To wipe the Moretti stain from the earth. It was justice, pure and simple." He stopped, close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his eyes, the faint lines of weariness around them. "And then I saw you at the Galliano Gala. Not as Alberto Moretti's daughter, but as you. And the plan, it became complicated. The vengeance I had nurtured for 2 decades suddenly felt hollow. What I feel for you. It is the most inconvenient, illogical, and real thing I have ever experienced." The admission hung in the air between us, naked and terrifying. He wasn't justifying his actions. He was confessing to a conflict I now shared. My father was the villain. The man I was supposed to hate was the victim. And somewhere in the wreckage of that truth, a feeling I refused to name was beginning to grow, tangled up with the shock and the grief. We were both prisoners of a legacy we hadn't chosen, bound together by a truth that had just set us both free and trapped us all over again. The door clicked shut behind her. There was no going back now. If you want to see what happens next, check out part 2, where everything unravels. Subscribe for more stories. The confession hung in the study's air, a truth so heavy it seemed to warp the space between us. The journal lay on the floor, its pages splayed open like a wound. The monster I had feared was gone, replaced by a man haunted by a ghost. The father I had loved was now a specter of betrayal. There were no more lies to hide behind, no more convenient hatred to shield me. We stood in the raw, uncomfortable truth. He didn't move to touch me. He just watched me process the ruins of my life, his own face stripped of its usual arrogance, showing only a profound, weary honesty. "We don't have to talk about it tonight," he finally said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "The truth doesn't expire." He turned and walked to the sideboard, pouring 2 more glasses of whiskey. This time, when he handed me one, our fingers brushed. It wasn't the possessive contact of before. It was an offering, a shared burden. I took the glass, the cool crystal a stark contrast to the heat of my skin. That night, for the first time, we didn't retreat to our separate corners of the fortress. We stayed in the study as the hours slipped past midnight. We didn't talk about the journal, or our fathers, or the war. We just talked. He told me about growing up alone after the murder, the weight of the legacy forced upon a boy. I told him about the shadow of the feud that had colored my own childhood, the constant, low-grade fear I'd never understood until now. We were 2 people who had been defined by a single, violent act that happened before we were old enough to comprehend it. We were both prisoners of a legacy not our own. The understanding that settled between us was fragile, a tentative truce built on the rubble of our shared history. He wasn't my captor anymore. I wasn't his prize. We were reluctant allies in a story that had been written for us in blood. "They are still safe," he said quietly, as the first hints of dawn lightened the sky beyond the windows. "He met my family. That part of the bargain, it stands regardless of this." Their safety is not a negotiating tool. It is a promise. It was the first promise he had ever made me that wasn't backed by a threat. It was a line drawn in the sand, separating the sins of the past from the possibility of a future. My compliance was no longer the price for their lives. Their safety was now a given. The chain that had bound me to him had just been unlocked. I looked at him, really looked at him, in the gray light of the new day. The ruthless Don Vincenzo Rossi was gone. In his place was just a man, as trapped by circumstance as I was, offering a way out of the cage our families had built. I made a decision then, not out of fear or obligation, but from a place of cautious, terrifying hope. Then I suppose we should figure out what comes next, I said. A ghost of a smile, the first genuine one I had ever seen on his face, touched his lips. It was a small thing, but it changed everything. The truce was sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared look in the quiet dawn. The war was truly over. And something else, something far more dangerous and unpredictable, was beginning. The truce reshaped the very air of the fortress. The locked door to my room remained unlocked. The silent, watching staff began to meet my eyes, offering tentative smiles. I was no longer a prisoner in a gilded cage. I was a resident, a guest with a complicated past. And with that shift came a new kind of access. Vincenzo began to include me in his world not as a spectator, but as a participant. It started with his legitimate enterprises. He ran a vast, intricate network of businesses that formed the public face of his empire. Shipping logistics, commercial real estate, and a consortium of high-end restaurants. One evening, instead of retreating to the study, he led me into a modern, glass-walled office adjacent to his private quarters. Screens glowed with market data, and blueprints were spread across a large table. "The city wants to redevelop the old docklands," he said, gesturing to the plans. "They see rust and decay. I see a new financial district. But the municipal council is hesitant." I looked at the plans, at the vision he was outlining. It was ambitious, clean, and transformative. This wasn't the work of a thug. This was the work of a visionary. "They're hesitant because of who you are," I said, the truth coming easily now. "They see the name Rossi and they think of back-alley deals, not billion-dollar investments." He nodded, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "Precisely. My reputation is my greatest asset in one world and my biggest liability in another. An idea, born from a lifetime of watching my father navigate the delicate politics of respectability, surfaced. Then don't lead with the Rossi name," I said. "Create a holding company. Something neutral. Let the project's merit speak for itself. You have the capital. You have the vision. Let them fall in love with the idea first. The name behind it can come later, once they're already committed." He was silent for a long moment, studying me not as a possession, but as a strategist. The respect in his gaze was palpable, a tangible thing in the quiet room. "Your father taught you well," he finally said, but there was no bitterness in it now, only a statement of fact. "He taught me about power," I corrected softly. "He just applied it differently." From that night on, I became his unofficial advisor. I sat in on conference calls, my perspective on the old guard social circles proving unexpectedly valuable. I could anticipate the objections of men who had been my father's peers. I understood the unspoken language of their distrust. Vincenzo, in turn, listened. He valued my intelligence, my insights. The partnership that began to form between us was born not from affection, but from a mutual recognition of competence. I was helping him build his legitimate legacy, and in doing so, I was quietly dismantling the monster of my childhood stories, replacing him with a man of formidable, focused ambition. It was a dangerous dance, this collaboration. With every problem we solved together, the line between captive and partner blurred a little more, and the foundation for something far more permanent began to solidify. Our fragile new world of late-night strategies and tentative trust lasted for 3 peaceful months. The holding company for the Docklands project was a masterstroke that immediately disarmed the wary city council. Investors, no longer spooked by the Rossi name, were lining up. Vincenzo and I had fallen into a rhythm, a partnership built on mutual respect that felt more solid, more real, than anything I had ever known. I'd almost forgotten the other world he inhabited, the one of violence and instant, brutal retaliation. The reminder came on a rainy Tuesday. I was in the glass-walled office, reviewing architectural schematics, when the door burst open. Silvio, Vincenzo's most trusted capo, stood there, his usually impassive face etched with urgency. He barely acknowledged me. "Don Rossi, we have a problem." Vincenzo looked up from his desk, his calm unwavering. "Speak." "The Lombardos," Silvio said, the name sending a cold shiver down my spine. A lesser family, known for their recklessness and ambition, who had been quietly seizing the minor territories our war had left unguarded. They hit the Bianchi shipment, took the entire truck at the border. They left a message. He placed a single bloodstained playing card, the ace of spades, on the desk. It was a declaration. They were no longer scavengers. They were challengers. Vincenzo's expression didn't change, but the air in the room went cold. This was a direct challenge to his newly consolidated power, a test of his strength. The old world was crashing into the new. He listened as Silvio laid out the details: the ambush point, the men lost, the Lombardos' growing boldness. The old solutions were simple: mobilize every soldier, descend upon them with overwhelming force, and erase the problem. But that was the thinking that had started generations of war. That was my father's way. As Silvio finished, Vincenzo's gaze shifted from the bloody card to me. It wasn't a look of consultation. It was an acknowledgement. He was seeing two paths forward, the hammer and the scalpel. The strategy came to me not from my father's lessons of brute force, but from a lifetime of watching him manipulate and outthink his opponents. "The Lombardos are impulsive," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "They're unified by greed, not loyalty. They'll expect the hammer. They'll have their men gathered, ready for a war." I met Vincenzo's gray eyes, seeing the strategist in him awaken. "Don't give them a war. Give them a choice." I laid it out. Isolate the weak link in their chain. The youngest Lombardo brother, Matteo, known for his gambling debts and resentment toward his older siblings. Make him an offer. Betray his family's location for a substantial payment and a one-way ticket out of the country. While their main force was braced for an attack on their front door, a small, precise team could hit their actual weak point from behind. Silence filled the room. Silvio stared at me, a new, grudging respect in his eyes. Vincenzo didn't smile. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Do it," he said to Silvio. Her plan. The operation was flawless. While the Lombardo brothers and their men waited for an army that never came, Vincenzo's team slipped into their unprotected headquarters, recovered the stolen goods, and seized their financial ledgers, the trustworthy source of their power. There was no glorious battle, just a quiet, humiliating collapse from within. The victory that evening wasn't celebrated with gunfire, but with a silent, shared look across the office. We had faced our first actual threat not as captor and captive, but as partners. And in that victory, the final barrier between us dissolved completely. He had trusted my strategy. I had helped him win. The collaboration was no longer just about business. It was about survival, and it had just solidified everything. The Lombardo victory wasn't just a strategic win. It was a seismic shift in my identity. The society pages that had once pitted me now ran photos of us leaving the opera, my hand resting confidently on Vincenzo's arm. The caption didn't read Mafia boss and his captive. It read Don Vincenzo Rossi and his partner, Isabella Moretti, at the opening night gala. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the tragic daughter of a fallen house. I was his equal, his consigliera, the woman who had helped him secure his empire not with fear, but with cunning. Months melted away, marked not by captivity, but by a quiet, deepening partnership. The fortress became a home. The staff, who once averted their eyes, now sought my approval on household matters. One afternoon, a secure, untraceable phone call confirmed my family's safe existence in a quiet European town, their lives peaceful, if distant. The last thread of the old bargain snapped. I was no longer here for them. I was here for him. For us. And the love was the most terrifying transformation of all. It didn't arrive with a grand declaration or a sweeping gesture. It grew in the quiet moments. In the way he'd have my favorite tea waiting after a long meeting. In the respect he showed my opinions, not as a courtesy to a prisoner, but as genuine regard for a partner. It was in the way he looked at me across a room, no longer with possession, but with a quiet, profound devotion that felt more binding than any lock. The hatred that had sustained me had been replaced by something far more powerful, far more dangerous. It was an understanding that had grown from the ashes of our war, a love built not on destruction, but on the peace we had forged together. I had been claimed, but I had become his in a way neither of us could have ever predicted. The door clicked shut behind her. There was no going back now. If you want to see what happens next, check out part 2, where everything unravels. Subscribe for more stories. The peace we had built felt unshakable, a fortress stronger than any made of stone. My mornings began with the scent of his coffee, my days filled with the shared purpose of our work. The past was a closed book, its painful truths accepted and shelved away. I had stopped looking for monsters in the shadows because I had found a man in the light. The first sign was a subtle wrongness, a shift in my own body I couldn't explain, a lingering fatigue that my strong coffee couldn't touch, a sudden visceral aversion to the rich aroma of his evening cigar, a scent that had once been as familiar as his presence. For a week, I blamed stress, the lingering tension from the Lombardo affair. But the truth was a quiet, persistent hum beneath the surface, a biological certainty my mind refused to acknowledge. The confirmation came on a bright, ordinary Tuesday. I stood in the pharmacy, staring at the small box in my hand with a kind of detached horror. The test felt like a verdict waiting to be read. Back in the privacy of our ensuite bathroom, the silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic hammering of my own heart. The minutes stretched into an eternity. And then the result. 2 stark, undeniable lines. A plus sign. A life. The world tilted on its axis. My hand flew to my stomach, a protective, instinctive gesture that felt both utterly foreign and completely natural. A child. His child. The product of the love that had grown from the ashes of our family's war. The ultimate, irreversible union of Rossi and Moretti. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me, followed immediately by a surge of something so fierce, so possessive it stole my breath. This changed everything. I didn't seek him out. I walked into his study, the plastic stick clutched in my trembling hand. He was at his desk, immersed in a blueprint, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as I entered, and his expression shifted from focus to concern in an instant. "Isabella? What's wrong?" I couldn't speak. I just held out my hand, the test resting on my palm like an offering. Like a grenade. He stood, his movements slow, deliberate. He took it from me, his fingers brushing mine. He looked down at the result, and for a long, suspended moment he was perfectly still. The powerful Don Vincenzo Rossi, the man who commanded armies with a glance, was utterly motionless. When he finally looked up, his gray eyes were wide, the usual impenetrable coolness completely gone. In its place was a raw, breathtaking vulnerability. Awe, and a joy so profound it seemed to light him from within. The fear in my heart didn't vanish, but it was suddenly eclipsed by the shocking sight of this man, brought to his knees not by a rival's bullet, but by a tiny, miraculous plus sign. Our world had just been torn open and made new, all at once. The news of the pregnancy transformed the fortress from a place of power into a sanctuary. Vincenzo's protectiveness, once a cage, became a cocoon. Doctors visited weekly. My cravings dictated the menu. He would watch me sleep, his hand resting gently on my growing stomach, a look of awe permanently etched on his face. The child was more than an heir. It was a living symbol of the peace we had forged from generations of war. The birth was a long, harrowing ordeal that stretched through a stormy night. But when the cries finally echoed through the room, a different kind of silence fell. Exhausted, drenched in sweat, I watched as they placed her in my arms. A tiny, perfect girl with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were already a startling clear gray. His eyes. She was the ideal fusion of us, the Moretti spirit and the Rossi intensity, made new. Vincenzo stood beside the bed, his face pale, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her cheek. The most feared man in the city was weeping openly, silently. "Sophia," he whispered, the name we had chosen for both our mothers. Our Sophia. Her arrival forced a final, necessary reckoning. A month after she was born, a letter was sent. Not a threat, but an invitation. My mother, living in quiet exile, was brought to a neutral location under a flag of truce. The meeting was strained, filled with the ghosts of the past. She held her granddaughter, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic reconciliations. Just the quiet, painful acknowledgement that this child represented a future our families had been unable to create for themselves. It was a fragile peace, but it was a start. 5 years later, I stand on the same balcony where I once watched my world burn. The city below is quiet in the pre-dawn light. The Docklands project is complete, a gleaming testament to the new era. The violence feels like a story from another lifetime. A small hand slips into mine. Sophia, her gray eyes serious, looks up at me. "The sun's coming, Mama." I squeeze her hand. "It is, my love." Vincenzo joins us, his presence a warm, solid comfort at my back. He doesn't speak. He watches our daughter, his love for her a tangible force. This is the legacy, not of bloodshed and territory, but of this quiet mourning. This child is playing where soldiers once fought. This peace that replaced the war. The final understanding of his declaration, "She is mine," has crystallized over time. It was never about possession. It was a recognition, a claiming of a shared destiny. It was the first brutal step on a path that led here, to this sunrise, to a love that didn't just conquer, it transformed. It ended a war by building something more powerful in its place, a family. The door clicked shut behind her. There was no going back now. If you want to see what happens next, check out part 2, where everything unravels. Subscribe for more stories. 5 years. A lifetime contained in the turning of seasons. The fortress is no longer a war monument, but a home filled with the sounds of our daughter's laughter echoing through halls that once knew only the click of guns being prepared. The city below us sleeps, bathed in the soft, pre-dawn blue, a piece we built with these hands. I stand on the balcony, the same stone where I once watched my family's world end, and now I watch our world begin each day. A small, warm body presses against my leg. Sophia, her hair a wild tangle, and her father's fierce gray eyes already wise beyond her 5 years. She points a tiny finger at the horizon. "It's coming, Mama." The first sliver of sun breaks over the skyline, painting the glass towers of the new financial district in hues of gold and rose. A district he envisioned that we built together. This is the legacy. Not the vanished rival or the conquered territory, but this quiet moment. This child, who will never know the weight of a feud she didn't start. This peace, hard-won and fiercely protected, replaced the endless cycle of violence. The declaration that shattered my life, "She is mine," was never about possession. It was a brutal, unrefined prophecy. It was the recognition of a shared fate, the first step on a path that led us here to this sunrise. To a love that didn't just conquer all, it made conquest irrelevant. He claimed that I would destroy a legacy, but our love created a stronger one from the ashes. Sometimes the most dangerous beginning is the one that saves you. If you believe in love that can end a war, subscribe for more stories where passion conquers all.